In the sprawling suburbs of Denver, Colorado, a 76-year-old retired business executive was about to challenge everything her family believed about aging gracefully. What started as a casual family dinner would ignite the most spectacular act of financial rebellion in 3 generations. Eleanor Catherine Harrison wasn't your typical grandmother counting down her final years. She was a woman who'd built a multi-million-dollar consulting empire from nothing, and when her own blood told her to act her age, she decided to show them exactly what a woman of her age and experience was truly capable of. Eleanor's response to family disrespect would lead to consequences none of them saw coming. What began as condescending comments about her lifestyle choices would become a masterclass in why underestimating your elders might be the most expensive mistake you'll ever make. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Catherine Harrison stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her custom-built home in Cherry Hills Village, watching the early morning joggers navigate the pristine sidewalks of one of Denver's most exclusive neighborhoods. At 76, she moved with the confident stride of someone who'd never learned to apologize for taking up space in the world. Her silver hair was cut in a sharp bob that framed intelligent gray eyes that had stared down corporate boardrooms full of men who'd initially dismissed her, only to discover their mistake too late. The house around her reflected 5 decades of success, not the gaudy displays of new money, but the understated elegance of someone who'd earned every dollar through intelligence, determination, and an unshakable belief in her own worth. Original paintings by emerging artists lined the walls. Eleanor had always preferred supporting unknown talent rather than paying premium prices for established names. Custom furniture filled rooms designed for both comfort and entertaining, each piece selected with the eye of someone who understood that true luxury wasn't about brand names, but about quality that would last generations. Eleanor had built Harrison Strategic Consulting, from a one-woman operation run out of her basement, to a firm that advised Fortune 500 companies on operational efficiency and crisis management. She'd started the business in 1982, when her husband James had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at just 52 years old. While other wives might have retreated into caretaking, Eleanor had channeled her need for purpose into building something extraordinary. The consulting fees had initially covered James's medical expenses, but as word spread about her analytical brilliance and strategic insight, the business had grown far beyond necessity into empire. James had passed away 12 years ago, after a 15-year battle that had tested every resource Eleanor possessed: financial, emotional, and spiritual. She'd cared for him with unwavering devotion, while simultaneously building a business that would outlast them both. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same family members who now questioned her lifestyle choices had been perfectly content to accept her financial support during James's illness and after his death. Eleanor's morning routine reflected the discipline that had carried her through decades of challenges. She woke at 5:30 a.m., not because age had disrupted her sleep patterns, but because she'd learned that the quiet hours before the world stirred were when her mind was sharpest. She spent 30 minutes reading, currently working through a biography of Josephine Baker that her personal trainer had recommended, followed by 45 minutes with said trainer, a 28-year-old former collegiate athlete named Marcus Thompson, who treated her with the respect of one professional to another. Marcus arrived precisely at 6:15 a.m., as he had every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday for the past 2 years. Their workout routine would have impressed people half Eleanor's age: weight training for bone density, cardio for heart health, and flexibility work that kept her moving with the grace of someone decades younger. Eleanor had hired Marcus not because she was trying to recapture her youth, but because she understood that physical strength was directly connected to mental sharpness and emotional resilience. "Mrs. Harrison," Marcus said as he set up the resistance bands in her home gym, a converted bedroom that overlooked the garden Eleanor maintained herself, "you're still planning to try that rock climbing class next month?" Eleanor adjusted her workout attire, practical athletic wear that fit properly, purchased from actual athletic retailers rather than the pastel leisure suits her daughter Victoria seemed to think appropriate for women of a certain age. "Absolutely, I've been researching the techniques online, and I think my grip strength has improved enough to handle the beginner walls." Marcus grinned with genuine admiration. "You're gonna show those college kids how it's done." This was the kind of interaction that sustained Eleanor, being treated as a person with goals and capabilities, rather than a fragile relic to be protected from life's adventures. Marcus saw her as a client and training partner, not as someone's elderly mother who needed to be humored. Their conversations ranged from current events to fitness trends, to Marcus's own goals of opening a training facility for adaptive athletes. Eleanor had been quietly researching business loans and investor opportunities for his venture, though she hadn't mentioned this to him yet. After her workout, Eleanor showered and dressed with the same attention to detail she'd brought to client presentations. Today she chose a tailored blazer in deep navy, wool slacks that fit perfectly, and low-heeled boots that were both elegant and practical. Her jewelry was minimal but high quality. Pearl earrings James had given her for their 20th anniversary, her wedding ring which she still wore on her right hand, and a watch that had been a retirement gift to herself, a Cartier that had belonged to the estate of a famous businesswoman she'd admired. Eleanor's kitchen was the heart of her home, designed for someone who actually cooked rather than merely reheated prepared meals. She made herself breakfast: steel-cut oats with fresh berries from her garden, coffee from beans she ordered directly from a small roaster in Costa Rica, and a vitamin regimen recommended by her concierge physician. She ate while reading the Wall Street Journal on her iPad, staying current with the business world she'd never really left. Several former clients still called for advice, and she served on the boards of 2 nonprofit organizations focused on women's entrepreneurship. The morning light streaming through her kitchen windows illuminated a woman who had refused to let aging define her limitations. Eleanor's skin showed the lines of someone who'd lived fully and faced challenges head-on, but her posture was straight, her movements confident, and her expression alert with the intelligence that had made her formidable in business and would prove equally formidable in dealing with family members who'd forgotten exactly who they were dealing with. At 8:30 a.m., Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Victoria. "Mom, we need to talk about Sunday dinner. There are some concerns we need to discuss as a family." Eleanor stared at the message, recognizing the tone immediately. It was the same voice Victoria had used as a teenager when she wanted to discuss why Eleanor's career was embarrassing to her friends' mothers who stayed home. The same inflection she'd employed as a young adult when she'd tried to discuss why Eleanor shouldn't date after James's death because it was inappropriate. The same condescending cadence she'd perfected as a middle-aged woman who seemed to believe that turning 50 somehow gave her authority over a mother who'd been navigating life's complexities since before Victoria was born. Eleanor finished her coffee slowly, considering her response. She could cancel Sunday dinner, avoid the confrontation she sensed building. She could acquiesce to whatever concerns her family wanted to discuss, play the role of the agreeable elderly mother who deferred to her adult children's judgment. She could apologize for whatever aspect of her life was currently causing them embarrassment or worry. Instead, she typed back, "Of course, dear. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone." Eleanor had spent decades in negotiations where the other party thought they held all the power, only to discover too late that preparation, patience, and strategic thinking could shift any balance. Her family was about to learn that some lessons in life came with a price tag none of them could afford, and that underestimating Eleanor Catherine Harrison was a mistake that would cost them far more than their pride. As she prepared for her day, lunch with her book club, followed by a meeting with her estate attorney to review some minor adjustments she'd been considering, Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent 76 years learning exactly how much power she possessed and how effectively she could wield it when circumstances required decisive action. The stage was set for a family dinner that would change everything, and Eleanor Catherine Harrison was ready to remind her ungrateful relatives that respect wasn't inherited. It was earned, and it could be revoked just as easily as money could disappear from a will that bore her signature at the bottom. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sunday afternoon arrived with the crisp clarity of late October in Colorado, the aspen trees on Eleanor's property displaying their final golden performance before winter's arrival. She'd spent the morning preparing what would become the most consequential family dinner in 3 generations, though none of her relatives suspected they were walking into anything more significant than another opportunity to voice their concerns about her lifestyle choices. Eleanor had decided to cook herself, despite her family's repeated suggestions that she hire caterers for such gatherings. The menu reflected both her culinary skills and her stubborn independence. Herb-crusted rack of lamb with rosemary potatoes, roasted vegetables from her own garden, and a chocolate torte that required the kind of precise timing and technique that supposedly became impossible after age 70. Each dish was a quiet rebellion against the narrative her family had constructed about her declining capabilities. The dining room table was set with her grandmother's Spode china, the goods set that had survived the Great Depression, World War II, and 7 decades of family celebrations. Eleanor had chosen it deliberately, a reminder that Harrison women had always been survivors who understood the value of both tradition and adaptation. Fresh flowers from her greenhouse, white orchids and burgundy dahlias, created centerpieces that spoke to her continued appreciation for beauty and her refusal to settle for the artificial arrangements her daughter Victoria favored. At 2 p.m. precisely, the family began arriving in a choreographed sequence that revealed their individual priorities and approaches to what they clearly viewed as a necessary but tedious obligation. Victoria Harrison Mitchell arrived first, as always, her silver BMW sedan announcing her presence in the circular driveway with the subtle ostentation of someone who needed others to notice her success. At 52, Victoria had inherited her mother's sharp features, but none of her warmth. Her expression perpetually arranged in the carefully neutral mask of someone who'd spent decades managing a pharmaceutical sales territory through a combination of aggressive networking and strategic complaint filing. She emerged from her car already checking her phone, her designer handbag coordinated with shoes that cost more than many people's monthly rent, but somehow failed to create the impression of effortless elegance she was clearly attempting. "Mother," Victoria said, offering Eleanor a brief, perfunctory embrace that managed to convey both duty and distance. "You look energetic today." The word energetic was delivered with the subtle inflection Victoria had perfected, a tone that suggested mild concern masked as compliment, implying that excessive energy in a 76-year-old woman was somehow unseemly or potentially problematic. Eleanor had learned to decode her daughter's linguistic patterns decades ago, recognizing the passive-aggressive vocabulary that allowed Victoria to express disapproval while maintaining plausible deniability. "Thank you, dear, I feel wonderful," Eleanor replied, her own tone carrying the warmth that Victoria's lacked. "How are Richard and the children?" Victoria's husband, Richard, was notably absent, a pattern that had emerged over the past several years, as family gatherings had become increasingly focused on what Victoria termed family business discussions. Richard, a mild-mannered accountant who genuinely liked Eleanor since the beginning, had apparently been deemed unnecessary for conversations about Eleanor's situation. "Richard's playing golf with clients," Victoria said, removing her coat with the precise movements of someone accustomed to having others watch her every gesture. "The children are both busy with their own lives, as you know." Eleanor did know. Victoria's twins, now 28, had been raised with such emphasis on achievement and networking that genuine family connection had become secondary to resume building. They appeared at family functions like visiting dignitaries, present in body but clearly calculating the minimum time required to fulfill filial obligations before returning to their real priorities. Robert Harrison arrived 20 minutes later, his arrival announced by the rumble of a pickup truck that seemed designed to contradict every assumption about successful middle-aged executives. At 49, Robert had inherited his father's height and Eleanor's business acumen, building a construction company that specialized in sustainable commercial buildings. His success was both more substantial and more personally satisfying than Victoria's pharmaceutical career, though he'd never felt the need to announce his achievements through luxury purchases or social positioning. "Hey, Mom," Robert said, wrapping Eleanor in a genuine embrace that reminded her why he'd always been her easier child. His clothes were clean but casual, jeans and a flannel shirt that had clearly been chosen for comfort rather than impression. "Something smells incredible in there." "Rack of lamb," Eleanor said, enjoying the way Robert's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Your father's favorite." The mention of James created a moment of shared remembrance that bridged the generational gap between them. Robert had been 24 when his father died, old enough to understand the magnitude of loss but young enough to still seek comfort in family traditions. Unlike Victoria, who'd processed grief by throwing herself into career advancement and social climbing, Robert had dealt with his father's death by becoming more intentionally present in family relationships. "Where's Jennifer?" Eleanor asked, referring to Robert's wife of 15 years. "She's visiting her sister in Phoenix this weekend. She sends her love and apologies." Robert paused, his expression shifting slightly. "Actually, Mom, she wanted me to talk to you about something." Eleanor felt the first tremor of warning, recognizing the careful tone that preceded unwelcome conversations. "What about?" "Maybe we should wait until everyone gets here," Robert said, his discomfort evident. Victoria wanted to discuss some things as a family. The phrase, "discuss some things as a family," was rarely followed by pleasant conversations. Eleanor had heard it before major announcements about divorces, career changes, and financial problems. Today, however, she suspected the discussion would be focused on her rather than originating from her. The final arrivals came together: Victoria's twins, Ashley and Brandon, now 28, and establishing themselves in careers that reflected their mother's emphasis on prestige over passion. Ashley worked for a prestigious Denver law firm, specializing in corporate mergers, with the single-minded focus of someone who viewed partnership as the only acceptable outcome. Brandon had followed a path through investment banking that kept him in expensive suits and constant stress, his success measured in billable hours and bonus percentages rather than personal satisfaction. Both twins greeted Eleanor with the polite affection of well-trained adults fulfilling social obligations. Their embraces were warm but brief, their conversation pleasant but surface level. They asked about her health, her activities, and her recent travels with the careful attention of people checking items off a mental list, rather than genuine curiosity about her answers. "Grandmother, you're looking well," Ashley said, her legal training evident in the precise way she chose words that conveyed appropriate sentiment without risking misinterpretation. "That's a lovely blazer." "Thank you, sweetheart. How's the law firm treating you?" "Busy, but that's good. Partnership track keeps you focused." Ashley's smile was practiced, professional. "I heard you've been taking some interesting classes lately." The word interesting carried undertones that Eleanor recognized immediately. Ashley had clearly been briefed on the topics Victoria wanted to address, and was beginning the careful reconnaissance that preceded a coordinated family intervention. Brandon positioned himself near the windows, his attention seemingly focused on Eleanor's garden, but his posture suggesting someone preparing for an uncomfortable conversation. At 28, he'd inherited Victoria's strategic mind, but lacked her social finesse, his discomfort with family confrontation evident in the way he avoided direct eye contact, while clearly listening to every word. "Uncle Robert," Brandon said, turning toward his uncle with obvious relief at finding a safer conversation partner. "How's the business? I heard you landed that hospital contract." Robert nodded, but Eleanor noticed he kept glancing toward Victoria, who had positioned herself in the living room like a general preparing to address troops. The family dynamics were arranging themselves in familiar patterns, Victoria assuming leadership, Robert providing reluctant support, and the twins serving as witnesses to whatever intervention was about to unfold. "Should we sit down?" Victoria asked, her tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing meetings. "I think we should talk before dinner." Eleanor felt a flash of irritation at having her own home reorganized according to Victoria's preferences. But she maintained her gracious hostess demeanor while mentally cataloging every slight for future reference. The family arranged themselves in her living room, Victoria taking the chair that provided the best view of everyone else, Robert settling uncomfortably on the couch, the twins flanking their mother like backup dancers. "Mother," Victoria began, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "We've been talking as a family, and we have some concerns we need to discuss with you." The phrase hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Eleanor settled into her own chair, the one she'd chosen specifically because it was both comfortable and positioned to command the room, and smiled with the patience of someone who'd weathered far more challenging negotiations than anything her family could devise. "I'm listening," she said simply, recognizing that sometimes the most powerful strategy was to allow others to reveal their intentions before showing your own hand. What followed would test every relationship in the room and demonstrate exactly why underestimating Eleanor Catherine Harrison had always been a costly mistake for anyone foolish enough to try it. The silence in Eleanor's living room stretched taut as a wire before Victoria cleared her throat with the deliberate authority of someone calling a board meeting to order. Eleanor recognized the gesture. It was the same throat clearing that had preceded every uncomfortable conversation Victoria had initiated since adolescence, from confessing teenage transgressions to announcing her engagement to Richard without consulting anyone about the timing. "Mother," Victoria began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who'd practiced this speech, "we're concerned about some of the choices you've been making lately. As your family, we feel it's our responsibility to address these issues before they become more serious problems." Eleanor remained perfectly still, her decades of corporate negotiations having taught her that premature responses often revealed more than strategic silence. She watched Victoria's face, noting the slight tension around her eyes that suggested this conversation was as uncomfortable for the deliverer as it was likely to be for the recipient. "What specific choices are concerning you?" Eleanor asked, her voice neutral and encouraging, employing the same tone she'd used with anxious clients who needed to articulate their problems before solutions could be explored. Victoria exchanged a glance with Robert, who shifted uncomfortably on the couch before nodding almost imperceptibly. The coordination confirmed Eleanor's suspicion that this intervention had been carefully planned, probably through a series of phone calls and text messages that had excluded her entirely. "Well," Victoria continued, consulting her phone as if reading from prepared notes, "there's the personal trainer situation. 3 days a week seems excessive for someone your age, and frankly, some of the exercises you're doing could be dangerous if you fall or overexert yourself." Eleanor felt the first spark of genuine anger but kept her expression pleasantly attentive. "Marcus is certified in senior fitness training. We focus on strength, balance, and flexibility. Exactly what my doctor recommends for healthy aging." "That's another thing," Ashley interjected, her legal training evident in the way she seized on Eleanor's response to build her own argument. "Dr. Patel mentioned to Mom that you've been asking about adventure travel and extreme sports." At 76, "Grandmother, don't you think rock climbing is a bit unrealistic?" The word unrealistic landed with the weight of a judgment that extended far beyond recreational activities. Eleanor recognized the implication that her goals, her interests, and her assessment of her own capabilities were fundamentally flawed because of her age. "Dr. Patel discussed my private medical conversations with you?" Eleanor's voice carried a hint of steel that made Victoria straighten slightly in her chair. "I called him because I was worried," Victoria said defensively. "When Brandon told me he saw you at the climbing gym doing research, I thought you might be having some kind of episode." The word episode hung in the air like an accusation. Eleanor understood immediately that her family had progressed beyond disapproval into speculation about her mental competency, a territory that was both deeply personal and potentially legally significant. "An episode," Eleanor repeated slowly, savoring the phrase like wine she was testing for quality. "Because I'm researching a new activity that interests me." "Mother, be reasonable," Robert said, his tone carrying the exasperation of someone who'd clearly been recruited reluctantly for this conversation. "Indoor rock climbing, martial arts classes, that photography expedition you took to Iceland last month, it's like you're trying to relive your 20s. "Instead of acting my age?" Eleanor asked quietly. The phrase seemed to electrify the room. Victoria leaned forward slightly, recognizing that they'd reached the core of their concerns. "Yes, exactly. You're 76 years old, Mom. There's nothing wrong with embracing a more age-appropriate lifestyle." Eleanor stood up slowly, moving to the window that overlooked her garden, where late-season roses still bloomed despite the October chill. The movement gave her time to process the full magnitude of what her family was proposing, that she voluntarily diminish herself to match their expectations of elderly behavior. "What would an age-appropriate lifestyle look like?" she asked, still facing the window. Brandon spoke for the first time since the conversation began, his investment banking background evident in his direct approach to problem-solving. "Grandmother, We've researched some excellent senior communities in the area, places where you could be around people your own age, with activities designed for your demographic. There's even one that offers bridge tournaments and book clubs. Eleanor turned back to face her family, noting how they'd unconsciously arranged themselves in a semicircle facing her chair, a classic intervention formation that positioned her as the problem to be solved rather than the person to be consulted. "You've researched senior communities," she said, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than anger. "Without asking me if I was interested in moving. We thought it would be good to have options," Victoria said quickly. "The Meadowbrook Senior Living Community has a wonderful reputation. Independent living, but with support services available if you need them. And it's only 20 minutes from my house." Eleanor absorbed the full implication of Victoria's words. Her family hadn't just discussed her lifestyle choices. They'd progressed to researching alternatives to her current living situation, apparently without considering whether she had any interest in changing her living arrangements. 20 minutes from your house," Eleanor repeated. "How convenient." Ashley shifted in her chair, her legal instincts perhaps recognizing that the conversation was moving into territory that might not favor their position. "We're not saying you have to move tomorrow, grandmother. We're just thinking about long-term planning." "Long-term planning for what?" The question hung unanswered for a moment before Victoria filled the silence with brutal honesty. "For the fact that you're not getting any younger, Mom. These adventure phases you're going through aren't sustainable. What happens when you get hurt doing something reckless? What happens when you can't maintain this house anymore? What happens when you need actual care instead of pretending you're still 40? The last sentence landed like a physical blow. Eleanor felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not hurt, but clarity. Her family wasn't concerned about her safety or happiness. They were concerned about the inconvenience her independence might eventually cause them. "Pretending I'm still 40, Eleanor said softly. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" Robert looked genuinely uncomfortable now, as if he were beginning to recognize that this conversation had moved beyond helpful family concern into something more troubling. "Mom, that's not what we meant." "No, Robert, I think that's exactly what you meant." Eleanor's voice was gaining strength rather than losing it. "You think that because I'm 76, I should abandon every interest that doesn't fit your idea of appropriate elderly behavior. You think I should move to a facility where my activities are organized by people who assume I'm incapable of making my own choices about how to spend my time." She moved back to her chair but remained standing, using the height advantage to address her family from a position of literal and figurative authority. "You think that because I'm your mother and grandmother, I owe you the comfort of having me behave predictably, safely, and conveniently." Victoria's professional composure was beginning to crack under the weight of Eleanor's controlled intensity. "That's not fair, Mom. We love you. We're trying to protect you." "From what? From living fully? From pursuing interests that bring me joy? From maintaining friendships with people you consider inappropriate because they're younger than me?" Eleanor's voice was rising slightly, carrying the strength of someone who'd finally identified the real issue at stake. "From making mistakes that could hurt you," Ashley said, her lawyer's instincts driving her to clarify the family's position. "From making decisions that could affect your health, your safety, your financial security." "My financial security," Eleanor repeated, and suddenly the entire conversation snapped into focus with crystal clarity. "We've finally reached the real issue, haven't we?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses. Heavier, more charged with recognition that they'd crossed into territory none of them had intended to explore so directly. "What do you mean?" Victoria asked, but her voice carried the artificial innocence of someone who knew exactly what was meant. Eleanor smiled for the first time since the conversation began, the expression carrying more weight than any anger could have conveyed. "I mean that your concern about my lifestyle choices isn't really about my safety or happiness. It's about your inheritance." The accusation lay between them like a live grenade, and Eleanor watched as her family's carefully constructed arguments began to crumble under the weight of exposed motivations. She had identified the real issue, and now everything that followed would be shaped by that fundamental truth. What came next would test every assumption her family had made about her priorities, her capabilities, and most importantly, her willingness to reward their disrespect with continued financial generosity. The word inheritance seemed to suck all the oxygen from Eleanor's living room. Her family sat frozen in tableau, each face revealing different degrees of shock, guilt, and defensive anger. Victoria's carefully constructed mask of concerned daughter had slipped entirely, replaced by the calculating expression Eleanor recognized from her pharmaceutical sales career, the look of someone whose strategy had been exposed but who was already formulating a new approach. "That's completely unfair," Victoria said, her voice tight with indignation that sounded more practiced than genuine. "This has nothing to do with money. This is about your well-being." Eleanor moved to the mantelpiece where photos chronicled decades of family history. James holding infant Victoria, toddler Robert taking his first steps, graduation ceremonies, wedding portraits, grandchildren at various ages. Each image represented moments when love had seemed unconditional, when family bonds had felt unbreakable. Now they served as evidence of how dramatically relationships could evolve when financial stakes became apparent. "My well-being," Eleanor repeated, running her finger along a silver frame containing her and James's 30th anniversary photo. "Tell me, Victoria, when exactly did my well-being become your primary concern? Was it before or after you calculated the value of this house in today's market?" Brandon shifted uncomfortably, his investment banking instincts clearly warring with his desire to remain invisible in this family confrontation. "Grandmother, we would never." "Never what, Brandon? Never discuss my assets among yourselves? Never speculate about when I might need assisted living? Never calculate how my adventure travel and personal trainer expenses might be affecting your future inheritance?" The accuracy of Eleanor's assessment was confirmed by the look that passed between Ashley and her twin brother, a flash of recognition that suggested these exact conversations had indeed taken place, probably in text message chains and private phone calls that had excluded Eleanor entirely. Robert stood up abruptly, pacing to the opposite window with the restless energy of someone whose discomfort had reached a breaking point. "Mom, maybe we have discussed practical concerns about the future. That doesn't make us monsters. It makes us responsible adults who care about what happens to you." "Responsible adults," Eleanor said, savoring the phrase. "Is that what you call children who research their parents' living arrangements without consulting her? Who coordinate with her doctor to discuss her private medical information? Who stage interventions about lifestyle choices that affect no one but herself?" She turned from the mantelpiece to face her family directly, her posture straight and commanding, despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "Let me ask you something else. When was the last time any of you visited me just because you enjoyed my company? Not for a birthday or holiday or family obligation, but simply because you wanted to spend time with me?" The silence stretched uncomfortably, as each family member seemed to search their memory for evidence that would contradict Eleanor's implication. Ashley opened her mouth as if to offer an example, then closed it without speaking. "When was the last time you called to ask about my day, my interests, my thoughts on anything not related to my health or your perception of age-appropriate behavior?" Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength as she articulated thoughts that had been crystallizing for months. "When was the last time you treated me like a person whose opinions and choices deserved respect, rather than like a problem to be managed?" Victoria's composure cracked further under the weight of Eleanor's questions. "We talk all the time, Mom. You know we care about you." "We talk about logistics," Eleanor corrected. "You ask about my health, my house maintenance, my financial planning. You tell me about your careers, your children's achievements, your social obligations. But when do we ever have conversations about ideas, dreams, experiences? When do you ever express curiosity about who I am beyond your mother and grandmother?" Eleanor moved to her bookshelf, selecting a leather journal she'd been keeping since James's death, a record of her thoughts, experiences, and personal growth during her widowhood. "I've been learning Spanish for 3 years. I can hold conversations with Rosa, who cleans the office building where I volunteer. Did you know that?" None of them responded, their silence confirming that they'd never thought to ask about her volunteer work or the relationship she'd formed there. "I've read 47 books this year, including biographies of women who accomplished extraordinary things after age 70. I've learned to use social media to connect with other widows who are rebuilding their lives. I've discovered that I love photography and have a natural eye for composition." Eleanor's voice carried wonder at her own discoveries, rather than resentment at her family's ignorance of them. I've made friends with people your age, Brandon and Ashley, who treat me as an equal rather than a fragile elderly relative. Marcus isn't just my trainer. He's someone who challenges me intellectually and respects my goals. Dr. Chen, who teaches the martial arts class, sees me as a student with potential, rather than a liability waiting to happen. Ashley looked genuinely confused, as if the idea of her grandmother having independent relationships and interests outside the family context was difficult to process. But why do you need all these new activities? What's wrong with the life you had? The question revealed the fundamental disconnect between Eleanor's perspective and her family's understanding of aging. They seemed to believe that reaching 76 meant accepting a static existence, maintaining current relationships and activities without growth or change. What's wrong with the life I had, Eleanor said slowly, is that it was built around other people's needs and expectations. For 50 years, I defined myself through my roles: wife, mother, businesswoman. When your father died, I had to discover who Eleanor Harrison was when she wasn't taking care of anyone else. She moved back to her chair, settling into it with the authority of someone reclaiming her own space. What I discovered is that I'm more curious, more adventurous, and more capable than I ever allowed myself to be when my primary identity was supporting other people's dreams. Robert stopped pacing and turned to face his mother, his expression troubled. Are you saying you regret the choices you made? That you resent taking care of Dad, raising us? I'm saying that those choices were made by a different woman in a different era with different options, Eleanor replied. I'm saying that the woman I am now has the freedom to make choices based on what brings me joy and fulfillment, rather than what other people think is appropriate for my age and circumstances. She looked around the room at her family's faces, noting the mixture of confusion, guilt, and persistent concern that suggested they were beginning to understand the magnitude of their miscalculation, but weren't sure how to adjust their approach. You came here today to convince me to act my age, Eleanor continued. What you don't understand is that I am acting my age. I'm acting like a 76-year-old woman who has earned the right to live exactly as she chooses. I'm acting like someone who has enough experience to recognize when other people are trying to limit her choices for their own comfort. Victoria made one last attempt to regain control of the conversation. Mom, we just want you to be safe. We want to know that you're making good decisions. Eleanor smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since the confrontation began. But the expression carried an edge that made Victoria lean back slightly in her chair. Good decisions, Eleanor repeated. Like the decision to remove ungrateful children from my will? The question landed like a bomb in the center of the room, and Eleanor watched with fascination as her family's true priorities became completely transparent in their immediate reactions. The mention of Eleanor's will created an immediate and visible shift in the room's atmosphere. Ashley's legal training kicked in instantly, her posture straightening as she processed the implications of her grandmother's casual reference to inheritance modifications. Brandon's face drained of color, his investment banker's mind clearly calculating potential financial losses. Victoria's carefully maintained composure shattered completely, replaced by naked panic that transformed her features. What do you mean, remove us from your will? Victoria's voice cracked slightly, the professional sales persona she'd maintained throughout the intervention dissolving into something raw and desperate. Eleanor settled back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd finally played the card that commanded everyone's complete attention. For 40 years in business, she'd learned that the most effective negotiations often required allowing the other party to reveal their true priorities before exposing your own strategic position. I mean exactly what I said, Victoria. I'm considering whether children and grandchildren who view their elderly mother as an embarrassment and liability deserve to inherit wealth they clearly believe should come with the right to control how I live my life. Robert moved closer to the group, his earlier discomfort now replaced by focused concern. Mom, that's a pretty extreme reaction to a family conversation about legitimate concerns. Legitimate concerns, Eleanor repeated, tasting the phrase like something bitter. Robert, let me share some of my legitimate concerns. I'm concerned that my own family researched assisted living facilities without consulting me. I'm concerned that my daughter contacted my doctor to discuss my private medical information. I'm concerned that my grandchildren apparently view my friendships and activities as topics for family gossip and intervention. She stood up slowly, moving to the antique secretary desk where she kept important documents, including the folder containing her current estate planning materials. The family watched her movements with the intensity of spectators at a sporting event where the outcome would determine their financial futures. Most concerning of all, Eleanor continued, opening the desk drawer with deliberate slowness, is the realization that none of you have ever expressed interest in my happiness, my personal growth, or my right to make autonomous decisions about my own life. Your concerns are entirely focused on minimizing risk, controlling outcomes, and ensuring that your inheritance remains intact. Ashley's legal instincts drove her to attempt damage control. Grandmother, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We absolutely care about your happiness. We just want to make sure you're not putting yourself in dangerous situations that could result in injury or what, Ashley? Expensive medical bills that might reduce your inheritance? Property damage that might affect the value of this house? Legal liability that might complicate estate planning? Eleanor's voice carried the sharp precision of someone who'd spent decades identifying the unspoken motivations behind carefully worded statements. The accuracy of Eleanor's assessment was confirmed by the look that passed between the twins. Another flash of recognition that these exact scenarios had indeed been discussed in their private family communications. Brandon made his first substantial contribution to the conversation, his financial background driving him toward quantifiable solutions. Grandmother, if you're concerned about our motivations, maybe we should discuss specific estate planning strategies that address everyone's interests. There are ways to structure inheritance that protect both your autonomy and our family's financial security. Eleanor felt a surge of anger at Brandon's clinical approach to what should have been an emotional family relationship. Family financial security, she said slowly. Brandon, do you hear yourself? You're treating this conversation like a business negotiation, rather than a discussion about love, respect, and family relationships. She pulled out a thick folder from the desk drawer, holding it where everyone could see the legal firm's letterhead on the documents inside. This is my current will and estate plan. Would you like to know what it contains? The silence that followed was electric with tension. Eleanor could see her family members struggling between their desperate curiosity about the document's contents and their awareness that expressing too much interest would confirm everything she'd accused them of. The house is valued at approximately $2.8 million, Eleanor began, noting how Brandon's eyes widened slightly at the figure. My investment portfolio, including retirement accounts and the business sale proceeds, is worth approximately $4.6 million. There are also collectibles, jewelry, and other assets worth perhaps another $300,000. Victoria's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. Mom, why are you telling us this? Because I want you to understand exactly what you're risking with your behavior today, Eleanor replied with deadly calm. Currently, this estate is divided equally among my children and grandchildren. Victoria and Robert each receive 40%. Ashley and Brandon each received 10%. She opened the folder and removed the top document, holding it where they could see her signature at the bottom. But wills can be changed, can't they, Ashley? Your legal training should have covered that. Ashley nodded reluctantly, her professional knowledge forcing her to acknowledge the truth she clearly didn't want to face. Yes, testators can modify their wills at any time as long as they're mentally competent. And am I mentally competent, Ashley? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ashley's legal training warred with her family loyalty as she recognized the trap her grandmother had laid. If she suggested Eleanor wasn't mentally competent, she'd be implying that her concerns about lifestyle choices were evidence of cognitive decline. If she confirmed Eleanor's competency, she'd be acknowledging her legal right to modify her estate planning in response to family behavior. Of course you're mentally competent, grandmother. Then you understand that I have the legal right to modify my estate plan based on my assessment of my beneficiary's character, behavior, and worthiness to inherit wealth that I earned through 50 years of hard work and smart financial decisions. Robert stepped forward, his earlier support for the family intervention now completely abandoned in favor of damage control. Mom, please don't make permanent decisions based on temporary family disagreements. We can work through this. Eleanor turned her attention to her son, noting how quickly his position had shifted once financial consequences became apparent. Temporary family disagreements, Robert? Is that how you categorize your attempt to convince me to abandon activities that bring me joy and move to a facility where my choices would be limited and monitored? She moved back to her chair, still holding the estate planning folder like evidence in a trial. Let me tell you what permanent looks like. Permanent is the realization that my own family views me as an inconvenience, rather than a person deserving respect. Permanent is understanding that your concern for my well-being is directly proportional to your concern about your inheritance. Victoria made a desperate attempt to regain emotional ground. Mom, that's not true. We love you. We've always loved you. Have you? Eleanor's voice carried genuine curiosity rather than anger. Victoria, when was the last time you told me you were proud of something I accomplished? When was the last time you expressed admiration for my courage in rebuilding my life after your father's death? When was the last time you celebrated my independence rather than viewing it as a problem to be solved? The questions landed with devastating accuracy because they highlighted the fundamental shift that had occurred in family dynamics. Victoria, Robert, Ashley, and Brandon had gradually moved from seeing Eleanor as a person who happened to be their relative to seeing her as a relative who happened to possess assets they expected to inherit. We celebrate your independence, Ashley said weakly, but her tone suggested she recognized how hollow the statement sounded. Ashley and Brandon exchanged glances that carried the weight of an entire conversation. As twins who'd grown up finishing each other's sentences, they seemed to be conducting a rapid assessment of their options through subtle facial expressions and microgestures. Ashley's legal training was clearly analyzing the enforceability of any changes Eleanor might make, while Brandon's financial background was calculating the potential monetary impact of various inheritance modifications. "We'll stay for dinner," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying the strained politeness of someone agreeing to terms in a negotiation where they'd lost control of the process. "Of course we'll stay." Eleanor nodded with the gracious smile of a hostess who'd just received expected acceptances to a dinner invitation, as if the previous conversation about inheritance modifications had been a minor family disagreement rather than a fundamental challenge to their relationships. "Wonderful. The lamb should be perfectly rested by now." She moved toward the dining room with the confident stride of someone who'd successfully maneuvered her opponents into exactly the position she wanted them to occupy. Her family followed with the careful movements of people who suddenly realized they were walking through a minefield where every step could trigger consequences they couldn't predict or control. The dining room Eleanor had prepared that morning now felt like a stage set for an entirely different kind of performance. The spode china that had seemed like a gracious gesture when she'd set the table now appeared almost ceremonial, as if they were dining on artifacts from a relationship that had fundamentally changed. The fresh flowers from her greenhouse provided elegant decoration for what had become less a family meal than a summit meeting, where the terms of their future relationships would be negotiated. Eleanor took her position at the head of the table, a seat she'd chosen not for convenience, but for the symbolic authority it conveyed. Her family arranged themselves around the remaining chairs, with the careful spacing of diplomats who weren't sure whether they were allies, enemies, or something more complicated. "The lamb smells incredible, Mom," Robert said, his tone carrying the overbright enthusiasm of someone trying to restore normalcy to a situation that had moved far beyond normal family dynamics. "Just like Dad used to make for special occasions." The mention of James created a moment of shared memory that reminded everyone present of what family relationships had looked like before inheritance calculations and lifestyle interventions had complicated their interactions. Eleanor felt a brief softening toward her son, recognizing that his discomfort with the afternoon's confrontation was genuine rather than purely financial. "Your father taught me that recipe during our second year of marriage," Eleanor replied, beginning to carve the lamb with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd hosted hundreds of dinner parties. "He said good food was one of the languages of love, that feeding people well was a way of showing them they mattered." The statement carried subtext that wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Eleanor was demonstrating love through the meal she'd prepared, while simultaneously questioning whether her family's behavior reflected genuine care for her well-being or calculated concern for their financial futures. Ashley accepted her plate with the careful attention of someone who recognized they were participating in a diplomatic dinner where every gesture carried significance beyond its surface meaning. "Grandmother, I want to apologize for how our conversation went this afternoon. I don't think we expressed our concerns in the most constructive way. Do you?" because today's conversation suggests you celebrate my independence only when it doesn't inconvenience you or challenge your assumptions about appropriate elderly behavior. Eleanor opened the folder again, removing what appeared to be legal forms with blank sections waiting to be completed. These are codicil forms, she explained, noting how Ashley's legal training made her recognize the documents immediately. Legal modifications to existing wills that can be executed without rewriting the entire estate plan. Very convenient for making targeted changes to specific bequests. Brandon's investment banking background made him understand immediately that Eleanor wasn't making idle threats. She had clearly researched the legal mechanisms necessary to modify her estate plan and had obtained the appropriate forms to implement changes quickly and efficiently. "What kind of changes are you considering?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious importance of her answer. Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully maneuvered her opponents into asking the exact question she wanted to address. "I'm considering redirecting inheritances toward people who have treated me with respect, kindness, and genuine affection, rather than people who view me as a financial asset requiring careful management." The implication hit the family like a physical blow. They were being evaluated not just as relatives, but as recipients of Eleanor's generosity, and their behavior during today's intervention had apparently failed her assessment of their worthiness. "What does that mean specifically?" Victoria asked, her sales training driving her to seek concrete information even as her voice revealed her growing panic. Eleanor stood up again, moving toward the dining room where her carefully prepared dinner was waiting, the meal she'd spent the morning creating for people who had apparently come to her home not to enjoy her company, but to convince her to diminish herself for their comfort. "It means," she said, pausing in the doorway between rooms, "that acting my age might include acting like a 76-year-old woman who's smart enough to recognize when people are trying to manipulate her, and wise enough to reward genuine love rather than calculated concern." She looked back at her family, noting their various expressions of shock, guilt, and desperate calculation. "Dinner is ready. We can continue this conversation over the meal I prepared, or you can leave now and spend the evening thinking about whether your relationships with me are based on love or greed." The choice she'd presented was clear. They could attempt to salvage their relationships through honest conversation and genuine respect, or they could face the consequences of treating their 76-year-old mother and grandmother like an asset to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. The silence that followed Eleanor's ultimatum stretched across her living room like a chasm that had opened suddenly between family members who thought they understood each other. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, her pharmaceutical sales training apparently providing no guidance for negotiations where the other party held all the leverage and had just revealed they were willing to use it. Robert paced to the window again, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested he was wrestling with competing loyalties, his support for his sister's concerns versus his growing recognition that their approach had backfired spectacularly. "We start by acknowledging that my age doesn't disqualify me from making autonomous decisions about my lifestyle, my relationships, or my living arrangements," Eleanor said. "We continue by establishing that family concerns should enhance my choices rather than limit them." Ashley leaned forward slightly, her legal training making her recognize the outline of a potential agreement. "What would family concern that enhances your choices look like?" "It would look like curiosity about my goals, rather than judgment about my methods. It would look like offers to support my adventures, rather than attempts to discourage them. It would look like celebration of my independence rather than treatment of it as a problem requiring intervention." Eleanor paused to take a sip of the wine she'd selected to complement the lamb, a bottle from a small Oregon vineyard she'd discovered during one of the wine tasting trips her family apparently considered inappropriate for her age. "It would look like recognition that I've earned the right to take calculated risks in pursuit of experiences that bring me joy." Victoria made another attempt to salvage her position in the negotiation. "What if we're genuinely worried about your safety? What if the risks you're taking seem unreasonable to us? Then you express your concerns respectfully and accept my assessment of my own risk tolerance," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "You don't research assisted living facilities behind my back. You don't coordinate with my doctor to discuss my private medical information. You don't stage interventions designed to pressure me into conforming to your expectations." The systematic dismantling of their intervention strategy was having a visible effect on her family members. Victoria's defensive posture was gradually relaxing as she began to understand that Eleanor wasn't rejecting family input entirely. She was demanding that it be offered with respect for her autonomy rather than assumption of her incompetence. Robert set down his fork and looked directly at his mother for the first time since the inheritance discussion had begun. "Mom, what would it take for you to trust that our concerns come from love rather than greed?" The question cut through the defensive maneuvering and strategic positioning to address the emotional core of their conflict. Eleanor recognized the courage it had taken for Robert to ask something that made him vulnerable to her assessment of his motivations and character. "It would take time, Robert. It would take consistent demonstration that you value my happiness as much as my safety. It would take evidence that you're proud of my courage, rather than embarrassed by my choices." Eleanor's voice softened slightly as she recognized her son's genuine effort to understand her perspective. "And what would it take for you not to change your will?" Ashley asked quietly, her legal training driving her to seek concrete terms for any agreement they might reach. Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully navigated a complex negotiation to reach the point where real solutions could be discussed. "It would take proof that my family relationships are based on love and respect rather than financial expectations. It would take evidence that you value me for who I am, rather than what I might leave you." She looked around the table at faces that were beginning to show genuine understanding rather than defensive calculation. "It would take a fundamental change in how you approach our relationships, from management and control to support and celebration." The terms Eleanor had outlined weren't impossible to meet, but they would require her family to completely restructure their approach to their relationships with her. Whether they were willing to make that fundamental change would determine not just their inheritance prospects, but the future of their family bonds. Eleanor noted the careful phrasing. Ashley was apologizing for their communication strategy rather than for their underlying assumptions about her lifestyle choices or their right to intervene in her personal decisions. It was a lawyer's apology, crafted to acknowledge fault without admitting legal liability or fundamental error in judgment. "What would a more constructive approach have looked like, Ashley?" The question put Ashley in the position of having to critique her family's intervention strategy, while they were all still seated around the dinner table. Eleanor watched with interest as Ashley's legal training warred with her family loyalty, forcing her to choose between professional honesty and personal diplomacy. "I think we should have asked about your goals and interests instead of assuming we understood what was best for you," Ashley said carefully. "We should have approached this as a conversation rather than an intervention." Brandon nodded agreement, his investment banking background making him appreciate the value of gathering information before making strategic recommendations. "We made assumptions about your risk tolerance and lifestyle preferences without actually consulting you about your priorities." Eleanor felt a flicker of approval for her grandchildren's more sophisticated understanding of the morning's errors. Unlike their parents, who seemed focused primarily on damage control, Ashley and Brandon appeared to be engaging in genuine self-reflection about their approach to family relationships. "What assumptions did you make?" Eleanor asked, continuing to serve dinner while maintaining the tone of someone conducting a business meeting rather than hosting a family meal. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly recognizing that Eleanor was systematically dissecting their intervention strategy and forcing them to articulate the prejudices and expectations that had driven their concerns. "We assumed that someone your age would want to prioritize safety and stability over adventure and new experiences. Based on what evidence?" The simple question exposed the fundamental flaw in their reasoning. Victoria, Robert, Ashley, and Brandon had constructed their entire intervention around cultural stereotypes about aging, rather than actual observation of Eleanor's capabilities, interests, or stated preferences. "Based on general assumptions about aging, I guess," Robert admitted reluctantly. "We didn't really ask what you wanted." Eleanor set down her carving knife and looked around the table at her family members, noting their various expressions of discomfort, guilt, and growing understanding. "For 40 years in business, I learned that successful strategies require accurate assessment of actual conditions, rather than assumptions based on theoretical models. You tried to solve a problem that existed only in your imagination." She served herself and settled into her chair, the physical act of joining them at the table creating a shift in the conversation's tone, from confrontation to something that might eventually become collaboration. "The problem you were trying to solve was the inconvenience and worry my independence might cause you. The problem I'm trying to solve is the disrespect and control my family is attempting to impose on me." Brandon took a careful bite of lamb, clearly buying time to formulate his response. How do we solve both problems without anyone having to compromise their core values? Eleanor felt a surge of respect for her grandson's direct approach to conflict resolution. Unlike his mother's attempts at emotional manipulation or his uncle's uncomfortable avoidance of difficult topics, Brandon was treating this as a negotiation that required mutually acceptable solutions rather than capitulation from one party. Ashley's legal training made her the first to ask the obvious question: what kind of modifications have you been considering? Eleanor opened her notebook to a page marked with a ribbon bookmark, revealing careful handwriting that outlined various scenarios and considerations. I've been researching ways to structure my estate that would support each of your individual goals and interests, rather than simply providing lump sum inheritances that might not serve your best interests. She looked around the table, noting the confusion on her family members' faces as they tried to process this unexpected direction. Victoria, I know you've been considering leaving pharmaceutical sales to pursue nonprofit work in health advocacy. Brandon, I know you're interested in starting your own investment firm focused on sustainable businesses. Ashley, I know you want to transition from corporate law to civil rights advocacy. Robert, I know you want to expand your construction business to include affordable housing development. The accuracy of Eleanor's knowledge about their individual aspirations was clearly surprising to her family members. Each of them had apparently assumed that their personal goals and career interests were private matters that didn't warrant discussion during family gatherings focused on logistics and obligations. How do you know all that? Brandon asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness. Because I pay attention to the things you mention casually in conversation, even when you don't think you're sharing important information. Because I remember the comments you make about work satisfaction and career frustrations. Because I listen when you talk about your dreams, even if you don't realize you're revealing them. Eleanor turned to a different page in her notebook, revealing what appeared to be detailed research about career transition strategies and business development resources. I've been working with my financial advisor to structure trust funds that would support your individual goals, rather than simply providing you with money to spend however you choose. Victoria stared at her mother with an expression that combined surprise, guilt, and growing understanding. You've been planning to help us pursue our dreams, and we've been worried that you were jeopardizing our inheritance through reckless spending. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. While you were calculating the potential impact of my personal trainer and adventure travel expenses on your future inheritance, I was researching how to use my wealth to support your happiness and professional fulfillment. Robert ran his hands through his hair with the gesture of someone processing a fundamental reordering of his understanding. Mom, why didn't you tell us about these plans? Because I wanted to see whether your relationships with me were motivated by love and respect, or by financial expectations. Today's intervention answered that question quite clearly. Ashley leaned back in her chair, her legal mind clearly working through the implications of Eleanor's revelation. So when you threatened to remove us from your will, you were testing whether we could separate our concern for your well-being from our concern about inheritance. I was discovering whether my family members were capable of treating me with dignity and respect when they believed their financial futures might be at stake. Eleanor corrected gently. The results were educational. Eleanor moved to her desk and retrieved a different folder, this one containing documents that looked more official and comprehensive than the codicil forms she'd shown them earlier. These are the trust structures I've been developing with my estate planning attorney. They're designed to support your individual goals, while ensuring that the wealth I've accumulated continues to create positive impact rather than simply maintaining comfortable lifestyles. She handed each family member a document with their name on it, watching as they read through what appeared to be detailed proposals for career transition funding, business development support, and long-term financial security structured around meaningful work rather than passive wealth. As the dinner plates were cleared and Eleanor served her homemade chocolate torte, a dessert that required the kind of precise timing and technique her family apparently believed she was no longer capable of executing, the conversation shifted from defensive damage control to something approaching genuine negotiation. The wine had helped relax some of the earlier tension, and the shared act of eating together had restored a semblance of family normalcy, even as everyone understood that fundamental changes in their relationships were being discussed. Eleanor watched her family members carefully as they savored the dessert, noting how their earlier panic about inheritance modifications had evolved into more thoughtful consideration of the terms she'd outlined. Victoria was making visible efforts to engage with Eleanor's perspective, rather than simply defending her own position. Robert seemed genuinely committed to understanding how their intervention had gone so wrong. Ashley and Brandon were approaching the situation with the analytical skills their professional training had developed, treating it as a complex problem requiring creative solutions rather than a simple matter of family authority. "Mom," Victoria said, setting down her dessert fork with the deliberate movement of someone preparing to make an important statement, "I want to acknowledge something that I think has been underlying our concerns about your lifestyle choices." Eleanor felt a flutter of hope that Victoria might be approaching genuine insight rather than simply strategic repositioning. "I'm listening. I think we've been treating you like you're our responsibility, rather than recognizing that you're an independent adult who happens to be our mother and grandmother." Victoria's voice carried the careful tone of someone who was working through thoughts in real time rather than delivering a prepared speech. "We've been acting like your choices affect us more than they affect you." The admission was more significant than it might have seemed to an outside observer. Victoria was acknowledging that their intervention had been driven more by their own anxiety and need for control than by legitimate concerns about Eleanor's well-being. It was a fundamental shift in perspective that could form the foundation for healthier family dynamics. Eleanor nodded approvingly. "That's a very mature recognition, Victoria. What do you think drove that approach?" Victoria looked around the table as if seeking support from other family members before continuing. "I think we got scared when Dad died that we might lose you too, and we started trying to protect you from risks that might take you away from us. But somewhere along the way, our protective instincts became controlling behaviors." Robert leaned forward, building on his sister's insight. "And I think we started measuring our love for you by how much we worried about you, instead of by how much we supported your happiness." Eleanor felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the wine. These were the kinds of insights that could rebuild family relationships on healthier foundations. Her strategic use of inheritance concerns had apparently forced her family to examine their motivations more honestly than they might have otherwise. "Those are both very perceptive observations," Eleanor said. "Now let me share something that might surprise you about my perspective on this situation." She stood up and moved to her purse, retrieving a small notebook she'd been carrying since James's death, a journal where she recorded not just her own thoughts and experiences, but her observations about her family relationships and her hopes for their future development. "I've been planning to modify my will for several months," Eleanor said, watching as her family members' expressions shifted from cautious optimism back toward alarm. "But not in the way you might assume." 3 months after the dinner that changed everything, Eleanor Harrison stood in the reception area of Harrison Family Foundation, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as Denver's early spring light illuminated the mountains beyond the city. The foundation offices occupied the top floor of a downtown building, chosen not for prestige but for the spectacular views that reminded everyone who worked there that their perspective should extend beyond immediate concerns to encompass broader horizons. The foundation itself had been Eleanor's final surprise for her family, an organization designed to channel their individual passions into collective impact, with each trust fund connected to foundation initiatives that multiplied their personal career transitions into community-wide benefits. Victoria's health advocacy work had become the foundation's health equity program. Brandon's sustainable investment firm operated as the foundation's social impact investing arm. Ashley's civil rights practice had evolved into the foundation's justice initiatives. Robert's affordable housing construction had become the cornerstone of the foundation's community development work. "Mrs. Harrison," came a voice from behind her. "Your 2 o'clock appointment is here." Eleanor turned to see Marcus Thompson, her former personal trainer, who had become the foundation's fitness and wellness director after Eleanor discovered his vision for adaptive athletics programs that served disabled veterans and elderly clients. The transition from trainer to program director had been one of many changes that followed her family's commitment to building relationships based on respect, rather than inheritance expectations. "Thank you, Marcus. Is the conference room set up for the presentation?" "Yes, ma'am. Dr. Chen has the martial arts demonstration materials ready, and Rosa finished preparing the lunch menu this morning. Dr. Chen, Eleanor's former martial arts instructor, now ran the Foundation's senior wellness programs, having discovered that his patient teaching style and emphasis on mind-body connection created extraordinary results with older adult students. Rosa Martinez, whom Eleanor had met through Marcus's community connections, had become the Foundation's nutrition education coordinator, bringing her restaurant management expertise to programs that taught healthy cooking on limited budgets. These were the people Eleanor had discovered when she'd refused to act her age. Individuals who had treated her with genuine respect and appreciation rather than condescending concern about age-appropriate behavior. When her family had demanded proof that her relationships were based on character rather than financial calculation, Eleanor had realized that the people who had never known about her wealth were the ones who had consistently valued her for her intelligence, curiosity, and determination. The Foundation's conference room filled with an unlikely collection of individuals who represented Eleanor's expanded definition of family. Her biological relatives occupied one side of the table: Victoria, Robert, Ashley, and Brandon, all looking more relaxed and genuinely happy than Eleanor had seen them in years. Their career transitions had been challenging but fulfilling, and the trust fund structures had allowed them to pursue meaningful work without financial stress. On the other side of the table sat Eleanor's chosen family: Marcus, Dr. Chen, Rosa, and several others who had become important parts of her life during her adventure in, quote, acting her age. These relationships had developed organically through shared interests and mutual respect, creating bonds that had proven more durable than blood relationships, based on obligation and expectation. Before we begin today's presentation, Eleanor said, taking her seat at the head of the table, I want to acknowledge what we've all learned about family, respect, and the difference between love and control. She looked first at her biological family, noting how their expressions had changed from the desperate calculation she'd seen 3 months ago to something approaching genuine contentment. Victoria, how has the transition to nonprofit work affected your perspective on success and security? Victoria smiled with an ease Eleanor hadn't seen since her daughter's childhood. I discovered that meaningful work provides a kind of security that money can't buy. The health advocacy programs we're developing are actually changing people's lives, and that impact makes me feel more successful than any sales quota I ever met. Victoria, your trust is designed to support a 5-year transition from pharmaceutical sales to health advocacy nonprofit work, including salary replacement during the transition period and startup funding for the organization you want to create. Victoria stared at the document in her hands, her eyes filling with tears, as she realized that Eleanor had not only been listening to her casual mentions of career dissatisfaction but had been actively researching solutions to help her pursue more meaningful work. Brandon, your trust provides seed capital for your sustainable investment firm, along with mentorship connections I've arranged with other socially responsible investors who've agreed to serve as advisors during your startup phase. Brandon's investment banking training made him appreciate the sophistication of the financial planning Eleanor had undertaken. Grandmother, this is incredibly generous, but also incredibly complex. How long have you been working on this? Since your grandfather died 12 years ago. I realized that inheriting wealth without purpose or direction often creates more problems than it solves. I wanted to ensure that my legacy would support your growth and contribution rather than your comfort and consumption. Eleanor handed Ashley her document, watching as her granddaughter's legal training helped her recognize the careful thought that had gone into every aspect of the trust structure. Ashley, your trust is designed to support your transition to civil rights law, including funding for the salary reduction you'll experience, moving from corporate practice to advocacy work, plus resources for the legal clinic you want to establish. Robert's document was the thickest, reflecting the capital-intensive nature of expanding a construction business. Robert, your trust provides the resources to scale your business toward affordable housing development, including partnerships I've arranged with other investors who share your commitment to socially responsible construction. The room fell silent as each family member absorbed the magnitude of Eleanor's planning and the depth of her attention to their individual aspirations. What they had interpreted as concerning spending on personal adventures had actually been part of a comprehensive strategy to understand how wealth could be used to support meaningful goals rather than simply accumulated for its own sake. "Mom," Robert said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "you've been planning to give us everything we actually wanted, and we've been worried that you were threatening to give us nothing." Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose long-term strategy had finally revealed its true purpose. "I've been planning to give you something much more valuable than money, Robert. I've been planning to give you the opportunity to use wealth as a tool for creating positive change rather than simply as a means of maintaining comfortable lifestyles." She looked around the table at her family members, noting their various expressions of surprise, gratitude, and dawning understanding of how completely they had misunderstood both her motivations and her priorities. "The question now," Eleanor continued, "is whether you're ready to earn these opportunities through the kind of respectful, supportive family relationships that reflect genuine love, rather than financial calculation." The choice she had presented was clear. They could commit to treating her with the dignity and respect she deserved as an autonomous adult, or they could face the consequences of relationships based on inheritance expectations rather than authentic affection. "And Robert, how has focusing on affordable housing development affected your business goals?" Robert's construction company had grown substantially since shifting focus towards socially responsible projects, proving that profit and principle weren't mutually exclusive. "I realized that building something that matters is more satisfying than building something that simply generates revenue. The affordable housing projects have attracted investors who share our values, and we're creating communities rather than just constructing buildings." Eleanor turned to her grandchildren, who had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformations during the previous months. "Ashley, what has your experience with civil rights law taught you about the relationship between career and character?" Ashley's move from corporate law to advocacy had required significant financial sacrifice, but the trust fund structure had made the transition possible without compromising her long-term security. "I learned that using my skills to protect people's rights feels completely different from using them to facilitate corporate mergers. The work is harder in some ways, but it's also more fulfilling because it aligns with my actual values, rather than just my financial goals." Brandon, how has sustainable investing changed your understanding of financial success? Brandon's investment firm had attracted clients who prioritized social and environmental impact alongside financial returns, creating a business model that proved responsible investing could be both profitable and principled. "I discovered that investors who care about more than just returns tend to be more thoughtful partners. Building wealth that creates positive change feels more sustainable than building wealth that simply accumulates." Eleanor felt deep satisfaction as she listened to her family members describe their transformations. The trust funds had provided financial security, but more importantly, they had created opportunities for her biological relatives to discover that meaningful work was more fulfilling than comfortable conformity. "Now," Eleanor continued, "I want to hear from the people who helped me understand what acting my age really means." Marcus straightened in his chair, still somewhat amazed to find himself serving as a foundation director rather than training individual clients. "Mrs. Harrison taught me that age is just information, not limitation. Working with her showed me that 76-year-old determination can be more powerful than 28-year-old enthusiasm." Dr. Chen nodded agreement, his martial arts background having prepared him to understand that wisdom and physical capability could coexist at any age. Eleanor demonstrates that learning and growth are lifelong possibilities. Her commitment to new challenges inspired me to develop programs that help other seniors discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed. Rosa, whose English had improved dramatically since joining the foundation staff, offered her perspective on Eleanor's approach to aging. "Mrs. Eleanor shows that respect comes from how you live, not how old you are. She treats everyone like family, so everyone treats her like family too." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to perspectives from people who had known her only as an individual pursuing her interests, rather than as a wealthy widow whose lifestyle choices required family intervention. "The lesson I want to share with all of you," Eleanor said, addressing both sides of the table, "is that acting your age at 76 means acting like someone who has accumulated enough wisdom to recognize love from manipulation, enough experience to distinguish between support and control, and enough confidence to surround yourself with people who celebrate your growth rather than fear your independence." She opened a final folder she'd brought to the meeting, revealing documents that formalized the foundation's structure and governance. These papers establish the Harrison Family Foundation as a permanent organization that will continue our work long after I'm no longer here to oversee it. The foundation will be governed by a board that includes both biological family members and chosen family members, ensuring that decisions are made based on program effectiveness rather than family politics. Victoria looked at the document with wonder rather than calculation. Mom, you're creating something that will last for generations. I'm creating something that transforms wealth from an inheritance into a legacy, Eleanor corrected. I'm ensuring that the money I accumulated serves purposes larger than individual comfort or family security. As the meeting concluded and people began gathering their materials, Eleanor remained seated, watching the interactions between her biological and chosen family members. The previous months had proven that respect, rather than obligation, created the strongest foundation for lasting relationships. Her phone buzzed with a text from her latest adventure, a photography class she'd joined where she'd met other people her age, who were also refusing to accept societal limitations. Tonight was the opening of their group exhibition at a local gallery, where her landscape photographs would be displayed alongside work by other students who ranged in age from 65 to 82. Eleanor Harrison had spent 76 years learning that acting your age meant acting like someone wise enough to choose your own family, brave enough to pursue your own interests, and confident enough to use your resources to create positive change rather than simply maintain comfortable security. The family that had once told her to act her age had learned to celebrate her refusal to accept limitations imposed by other people's expectations. And Eleanor had discovered that the most valuable inheritance she could leave wasn't money. It was the example of a life lived with purpose, dignity, and the courage to keep growing regardless of what age society thought she should act. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.